Welcome to the first episode of the In Between Classes podcast. I am your host, Will Gottlob, and alongside me is my co-host, Mr. Josh Schmidt. I guess we'll start this podcast talking about the unusual dynamic Mr. Schmidt and I have between each other. So, Mr. Schmidt, I guess, do you want to introduce yourself here?
Yeah, I've been teaching 10 years, and I actually was Will's 8th grade algebra teacher during my very first year of teaching. He was in my class, and we were talking before we started the podcast about like, what am I Mr. Schmidt? Am I Josh? It's a weird dynamic because no matter how long you haven't had your students, you always think of them in that context. And so when Will asked me to help him with the podcast, I was so excited to be able to work with a former student on something they were really passionate about. Like, how often as an educator do you get to do that? So Will, you can call me whatever you want. If you want to be the first day that you call me Josh, and then I'm okay with that. Whatever you want to do.
Honestly, for the sake of, just not annoying our listeners hearing Mr. Schmidt or things like that, I think I'll probably just call you Josh.
Maybe the listeners prefer Mr. Schmidt. Sounds more professional. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess so. For that aspect, we can kind of get into talking about who we are, like why I can kind of almost consider myself a peer in that aspect.
I absolutely think of you as my peer. For the listeners, Will last year came up with the amazing idea for a senior project of developing a customized unit. And for those who don't know me at all, I teach in a customized math setting, which means that my students are able to work through content at their own pace, at their own level, and then they get to make choices within those levels. And Will did an amazing job of starting that while he was in college, of developing a unit. So if you want to tell people a little bit about that project.
Well, that's definitely something we'll get into. I guess before we get way too deep into, stuff that we want to talk about here, we should probably do some formal introductions,
All right.
Talk about what the point of this podcast is, and then basically just explain why, this idea of a self-paced classroom, why it's a topic of discussion for the two of us. So I guess the whole concept of this podcast that the two of us are trying to work through is we're both incredibly passionate about education. Mr. Schmidt obviously being a teacher now for 10 years or so, and then myself, I'm actually still a senior in college going into math education. So that's something we obviously share a bond about, and, just figured, why not sit here and talk about it and, just bounce ideas off each other and see if there's anything that any listeners would ever get out of it.
And I love the idea. I think the idea of the name of In Between Classes was something that was interesting to me because it's conversations that teachers could have as they step outside their classroom and they're waiting for period 6. That, especially if you're in an environment where you have that ability to bounce ideas off your coworkers, it can help you grow as an educator really fast. So even if this podcast doesn't, take off or listen, a lot of listeners, I think that forcing Will and I to have really deep educational conversations is always going to be beneficial.
Yeah, so again, that was pretty much the idea about it, is just having good conversations, seeing if there's anything we can learn. I mean, obviously, there's stuff I can learn from you. Maybe there's a thing or two you could learn from me, and
Absolutely.
Basically just trying to make ourselves better educators. And if anybody else would, for some reason, want to listen to this, maybe they'll get something out of it. So that's, the main focus of what we want to do here. Second one, and this is just kind of, a pleasure of mine, is sports. I mean, the reason I wanted to do a podcast, because I've become so enamored with sports podcasts, sports radio, it started with listening to Colin Cowherd on the radio. It evolved into the Dan Le Batard show, the Bill Simmons podcast. Just sports and podcasting is something that I've really gotten into lately, and so that's why sports is something we'll also tie in here. And on top of that, Mr. Schmidt, you obviously, Josh, my bad.
See, I told you it was going to happen. It's hard. It's hard to break it.
Yeah.
No, I think that
sports is obviously something just as much about that as you do education. So again,
Yeah.
just having good conversation about sports is something that would just be more fun than beneficial, if anything.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to talk later about some ideas on how to incorporate sports into math education specifically, and ways to use something students are already interested and motivated by, and using some of that motivation to teach some high-level math concepts.
Right. So I guess we've given you the idea of what this podcast is about. Now we just want to kind of introduce ourselves, explain who we are just a little bit more, and then kind of you guys our audience can understand where our views come from, why we think the way we think, and just kind of get to know us a little bit better. So, Josh, you want to start, or myself? However,
I'll start. So I've been teaching 10 years, middle school math right now. I actually was able to move across the country from South Dakota, where I taught Will, to Maine in the last 12 months, and it's been a incredible journey. And education is the reason why I was able to make that transition. Using my teaching style and methodology, it allowed me to find schools on the East Coast that definitely fit my philosophy. And now I'm in an environment where I'm not the most unique teacher in my building, that there are lots of people who do different personalization or customization structures that are really, really exciting, and it's allowed me to grow, definitely.
Right, yeah. And then, on top of that, so like I said, you taught in South Dakota. You grew up in Lennox?
Lennox, yep. I grew, Iowa and South Dakota pretty much my whole life.
Right. So at the same time that you decided to move, I don't even know how far Maine is, several thousand miles east, I decided to go a couple hundred miles west. So like I said, I grew up in Salem, but now I'm going to school in Spearfish, South Dakota at Black Hills State. So that's the other interesting dynamic about this podcast. We're actually, there's thousands of miles in between the two of us, and I guess we're just kind of running this podcast over Skype. So there will definitely be some interesting dynamics that come with that, but we're making do, seeing what we can do.
Yeah, see if we can get that sound quality up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the first. We just spent like a half hour trying to figure that out before we started here. So, yeah, I guess then a little bit more about ourselves, maybe. So, like I said, I'm still a student at Black Hills State. My goal is to be a high school math teacher. That's what I'm going to school for, and just my interests, obviously, sports. I've been coaching basketball at Belle Fourche High School now for a couple of years while I've been in college. I'll actually be starting that up again in a couple of months when basketball season starts. So, yeah, just, again, that's the reason for the podcast. I have an incredible interest in sports. I have an incredible interest in education. And so, yeah, I guess, is there anything else important that we should probably mention before we continue on with this, or what are your thoughts?
No, I think we got to some interesting stuff. I have a few questions for you as a new educator, but I think they're going to work really well in our first couple topics.
Okay, well then, if that's the case, then let's just move right on to one of the first topics we wanted to cover. Is just the idea of, Mr. Josh started school less than a month ago. I started school here at Black Hills State less than a month ago, so one of the first natural topics is, what are early in the year activities that you can do, whether they be first day introduction stuff or first couple weeks? What are some interesting beginning of the year projects that, we could think of? So, Josh, I'll let you start with that.
So the reason why I wanted to put this into the first podcast is I tried to do something a little bit different this year. I believe very strongly, especially in a middle school classroom, that you want the students to have some involvement in the rulemaking process and some involvement in the classroom procedure process. But I also some part of me disliked that first day where you write your name on the board and say, "Hi, my name is Mr. Schmidt, and let's go through the rules of the classroom." So I tried this year to, instead of telling them what class is going to be like, I wanted to drop them into a lesson that we could actually do in the year. So I did something called Magic Squares, which is not a super creative topic, but it's kind of a spiritual relative to Sudoku puzzles. You have For example, a 3x3 magic square uses the digits 1 through 9, and you have to have the same sum for every row, column, and diagonal. I split the kids into groups. I gave them the cards, and we did about a 90-second introduction, and I said, go. And every time something would happen in the classroom that is a rule or procedure, like a kid needs to leave to take a break, I would stop the class and explain the procedure. When a kid, needed a behavioral reminder, we stopped the class and talk about what happens in the situation. When someone wanted help from another group, we stopped the class and had a conversation. And it didn't work perfectly, but there was something really magical about just dropping them into a normal day of class and then showing what happens. Especially in a customized environment, there are so many special situations. You can't go through all of them.
So you're saying basically you've had these kids for about a minute and 30 seconds, and then instead of like explaining who you are, asking them to introduce it, you're just like, hey, go start doing this. And then if something comes up, I'll explain what's going on.
Yeah, and it was interesting because that kind of does explain me. That was probably the most authentic way to introduce myself to my students is, here's 90 seconds, here are the cards, here are your groups, go. And the kids were a little bit overwhelmed. There were deer in headlights looks right away. But there was something really, really cool about it. And I wanted to see your take on early in the year activities. Because when I started teaching, that was something it took years and years for me to even start thinking about how important those first few days are.
Right. I guess I don't know if this is just terrible memory or what be the case. I can't really think back to first days of the year for high school. Like, I can't really think of any big projects that we did or things like that. So I guess for that reason, again, I'm not trying to discount any of my high school teachers, but it seemed like we didn't do anything very memorable on the first day. I mean, I'm assuming it was the, teacher introduces themselves, talks about maybe it was just a lot like college these last 3 years. I mean, I can think of the first day of college for every class. We walk through the syllabus, teacher explains who they are, talks about what you can expect for the semester. That's the end of the first day. Okay. So
and do you think that's and I don't, I'm with you. I don't want to make it seem like a teacher who starts a classroom that way is necessarily ineffective. But in the environment that you're trying to create as an educator, do you feel like that's the type of start that you want with your students? Or do you want to try to come up with these possible activities that are not just about team building necessarily, but maybe a little bit math-based as well?
Yeah, that should be the goal for a high school teacher. Like it's different in college where you have a professor, you'll have them for 4 months, you may never talk to them ever again. But when you're a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, you're actually like building more meaningful relationships. So yeah, I think it can't just be sit and go through the syllabus. It has to be a little bit more meaningful, and that actually brings me to the one. It's my secondary ed, like 408 class, whatever it is. We have, it's a small classroom. We're all going into education, and the teacher that we have, Dr. Stone, she is trying to make it a very, I don't want to say feel like high school, but try and have that relationship building where, the first day of her class was project-based stuff. It was introducing ourselves, getting to know each other. That was the focus of the first day. It wasn't, here's what we're going to go through for the semester. We're going to build relationships with each other, and then we'll worry about what we're going to do for the semester next class.
Did that stand? And so you said that you didn't remember the first day of high school. I don't either. But do you feel like that experience with that teacher, at the very least, made that teacher's class stick out more to you compared to your other classes?
Yeah, I mean, it might be, you might say it's easier just because this happened just a couple of weeks ago with her class, but it stands out more in the aspect of which, like you said, we're actually doing something. We're not just sitting there going through the syllabus. Now, another thing that she did that I really enjoyed, and it was actually some videos. We obviously been watching videos about different educators and their teaching styles. One thing she actually did was we had to do like a Google survey or something like that. I don't even know what it was, but essentially one of her opening class activities was us deciding, okay, what are going to be the rules for this classroom? Okay, if there's a missing assignment, what's the punishment for that? Things of that nature. And I like that idea, that it's got to be explored. Like, there's definitely a fine line between letting the kids decide the rules, but they also should be involved in some aspect, I think. And I guess I'm still trying to figure out where that fine line is and how that would work out best.
I think, and this is one of the pieces of why I've been really excited to be able to help you as you start your process to becoming an educator, because right there is something that a lot of career teachers value very highly, especially when you're talking about elementary and low middle school classrooms. The student being involved in that process is something a lot of teachers feel like is incredibly valuable and very motivating to students, and you do this a lot. You come up with really genuinely good, interesting ideas, and then I look back at myself as I was becoming a new teacher, and I'm a little bit jealous that if I felt like it took me a lot longer to start asking the right questions than I feel like you are. You're at the very least, you always seem to be thinking about the right problems, and then teaching is all about, finding solutions, and you're never going to figure it out on the first try. But I spent a lot of time my first couple of years not really knowing what were the right questions to ask.
Right, yeah, and that's almost what's daunting. I mean, it's almost daunting. I want to sound like I know everything, because I obviously know pretty much nothing, because my thought is I kind of recognize how difficult it is, and that's more daunting than anything, where I see some people or you read about some teachers that come in, they think everything is just going to go great and everything. They don't realize how daunting it might be. So I don't know, maybe if I'm almost scared, because I know that I should be thinking about these things, that, I mean, it'll be in less than a year and I'm going to be running my own classroom, which is, like I said, kind of a scary thought. But
I think, going along with that point too, the best teachers that I've met in my career talk a lot more about the things that they need to do better than the things that they do well. And so I don't, even myself, I'm 10 years in, there's always something that we can improve and work on. And I just feel like good teachers are always focused on what the next step is or what the next improvement is, which actually kind of brings us to our next topic a little bit.
Right, yeah, and that, I guess the next natural thing is talking about goals for whether it be the year, the semester, or even weekly goals, and I guess how that plays into what is the teacher's job when it comes to setting goals. Obviously they set curriculum and decide what the students have to learn throughout the year, but I guess, again, I'm going to defer to you here. Is setting a yearly goal, is that strictly on, I want to say we want to get through X amount of curriculum, or is there something else that goes into setting a yearly goal for your students?
I think there's a lot to do with classroom design elements. My classroom is always about this weekly goal, this monthly goal, this quarterly goal, and I force the kids to be very specific on what those goals are. And I feel like it would be disingenuous if I, the educator, was not doing those same things with my students. And I feel like setting good goals that are difficult but maintainable is really healthy for teachers to do. Because teaching it's so easy to fall into that day-to-day plan. There's so much work to do each and every day that just having, I like try to set my goals, I write them down like on a legal pad by my desk. So I just have to look at them. I have to try to get a little bit closer to them. And that way, even though I'm spending a lot of my time, grading papers and setting up lesson plans and getting assignments and projects ready to go, I look over here on the side and say, oh yeah, I also want to be working on that a little bit. And I feel like it's incredibly healthy to just have specific goals that you're constantly working towards.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, so it is, again, it just comes back to, it's daunting. Like, you have these day-to-day tasks as a teacher. You have to grade stuff here and there. You have to be prepared for the next lesson. There's so much stuff that goes into the day-to-day that just having a long-term, being able to keep an eye on long-term goal just seems like it's like I said, I mean, people are going to think, why in the world do I want to go into education? It just sounds like I make it sound like it's absolutely terrible.
Well, and I think the difficulty of the job is always what drew me to it. And I wanted to be a high school teacher when I was going through school, and then I stepped into a middle school classroom, and it's like this gust of wind that is always threatening to knock you over. And it's never boring. And it's just an amazing feeling how tired you are at the end of every day. You're absolutely right, though, that those goals are incredibly daunting and difficult and challenging. But if you do a good job of setting them and making a little bit of progress at a time, it feels so good to be able to set those. Like last year, moving in across the country, my yearly goal is I wanted to go into someone else's classroom and do some of those cross-curricular projects that I've done before, but I had been working with teachers for years and years. And at the very last 2 weeks of the school year, I was able to do the Planets project with a coworker of mine. It took the entire year, but it felt so good at the end of the process to pull that off.
Like 1 year, goal it wasn't really set for your students, but for yourself, something that you will accomplish by the end of the year. I mean, is for the students, but there was something that you wanted rather than, okay, those are set in place, type of thing.
Yeah, and I think that some of those goals can be mixed with students. Like, I think that's entirely reasonable, right? That, being able to work with a kid on a specific goal is really healthy. But sometimes the goal can just be, I need a better management system for turning in assignments day to day, or I need a better system of grading assignments every day, or my goal last year for the first semester is I need to get out of the building before 5 p.m. every day. And little things like that can take your focus away from the day-to-day grind a little bit can be incredibly helpful. And even if they're small and you don't always hit them, I think it's just something that every teacher could benefit by a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So while we're on the goals, I figured, we might kind of talk about what this podcast is, just because, like you said, if you have them laid out there, then it's out there that you can keep an eye on. So I guess here, personally, some of my goals try and have for this podcast, and if we get them done, great. If not, so be it. So kind of the format that we've kind of talked about is have at least an episode every couple of weeks. You do, my thought was maybe 6 episodes spring, then we'll call season. Does that sound something we should be able to accomplish?
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you real fast, there's a little bit of lag coming from your end. We're getting most of it, but if there's something on your computer, it's popping up.
Yeah, I'm catching that a little bit.
Yeah, but and it's we're getting most of it. But if there's something that you can look at, check that out. In terms of the podcast itself, I feel like every couple of weeks would be a really solid amount. And then when you get into coaching season, especially, those couple of weeks are going to be a lot more difficult. So if we can get 12 in a year, I feel like that's a really solid amount. And so, like I said before, this conversation is just so healthy to have. And like, how often, do you get to talk to former students, and being able to help former students like set goals like this? It feels really good, even if it's something that ends up being a little short term.
Right. I agree with that. So yeah, it sounds like we're pretty much on the same page on what we're hoping we get out of this, at least for the first year. And if it seems like something that's relevant, we'll try and continue it on, but I guess we'll see after that. So I guess that brings us to, like I said, the more, but my favorite part, the sports side of this, the side that makes me feel like I'm sports radio guy, the reason why I like doing this. So I guess one of the sports things we talk about, this might be the lowest denominator in sports talk, but fantasy football, fantasy sports, things like that. And, obviously we both do fantasy sports. I'm big into fantasy football. I guess I don't know everything that you do, but it's something that we feel like we know about. And, I guess we'll give some thoughts on it. So I don't know, how would you include math and other things in fantasy football? Because I know you said that was kind of your goal in this.
Yeah, and I feel like you always got to be careful to not pick a topic that only a small subsection of your class would really enjoy. But what I was hoping to do with fantasy football is this year one of my goals is to have what I call weekly and monthly quests for students. So they have these topics that are outside of the content that are a little bit more inherently interesting. And I wanted to explore the idea of expected value inside of fantasy football. The question, I like always starting with the question, asking the kid, all right, so your running back expects to get 13 6/10 points this week. My question is, why and how did they get that number? And there's something really interesting about the algorithms that are going into that process that, even though the answer is incredibly complicated and difficult for a middle school student to understand, there are some really cool conversations that can happen within that.
Right, yeah, I get that. So, and I mean, that's honestly how I completely formulate my draft strategy. Again, this is going to sound incredibly nerdy getting into my draft.
No, I love it. Just go right into the nerdiness.
We're just going to dive right into that. So I guess how I did it was I went through, I looked at what each player scored last season. Fantasy football analysts like Matthew Berry and people of that nature, and compare their rankings of that player, and I guess just give that player an expected value, what I think they will be worth points per game throughout the season. And that obviously is, I mean, really everybody's kind of doing that in some aspect, whether they think about it or not. It's just I was putting concrete numbers on these players based on those numbers from last season. So, yeah, whereas you want to include in the classroom, I'm just selfishly looking at it as, okay, how can I beat my friends in this?
So I have a question for you in terms of draft strategy, because I struggle with this. It's something that I've heard called, on the old Grantland website before that shut down, which I miss so very much, is a topic called value above replacement. So the idea is the reason why Gronkowski, for example, is so valuable as a tight end is not because you're comparing him to every player in the league. You're comparing him to tight ends. And he is specifically that much better than the replacement that you would get if you drafted him later. So how do you take that concept into your draft strategy to make sure you're getting the highest value above replacement?
Well, again, like I said, I just kind of gave each player an expected value, and honestly, I took even a step further. I went through and I took the average scoring output of last year's top 12 running backs. So the average is the top 12 guy. In this case, I'm looking at it right in front of me. Last year, our average top 12 running back scored, where did I have that? Last year, our average top 12 running back scored 15.4 points per game. So my thought was, whoever my starting running back is, whoever my number one is, if he's not scoring 15.4 a game, if he's scoring 13 a game, that's 2.5 points I need to pick up somewhere else. So that's where, if I can have the best running back in the league, I can have Todd Gurley, and suddenly I'm beating the average back by 6 points, then that means I can have I can let off on 6 points somewhere else, is how I see it. So yeah, that idea of value above replacements in certain positions, it's so incredibly important. Like quarterback, unless you have Aaron Rodgers, maybe Drew Brees, quarterbacks 2 through 15, pretty much the same guy. Whereas running backs, if you don't have one of those top about 6 guys, running backs roughly 8 to 20, that is such a drop off. And that's why it's so vital to have that running back, probably get him in the first round. If you don't get a running back in the first round, you're always hurting.
Yeah, and I think that for students, I was able to do an elective on fantasy football last year, kind of give them the very basics of the concept. And my students struggled with, they just wanted to pick their favorite players. And they ended up Yeah, they ended up getting annihilated, right, in the first couple of weeks against, a couple of the students in the class that had done fantasy football a little bit, and they're like, okay, I really enjoy Tom Brady, but I don't really need to draft him first pick, first round. And that was a really cool, interesting advisory, and we did that once a week for 6 weeks. And we didn't get super in-depth with it, but it was a lot of fun to do. And there was some really high-level mathematics that you can explore with kids in doing that.
Right. So, I mean, I guess the goal is to, make your students realize to get value over, just, I don't know, skill or something, like value over top rated. Did, like, the students who were just getting annihilated who wanted to pick, I'm sure you have like a Vikings fan who wanted to pick Jerick McKinnon in the first round last year, something ridiculous like that. Did they, like, realize after the first couple weeks of just getting killed, they're like, oh, maybe I should do something else? Or did they just not take interest in it, like, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing?
Yeah, out here it's New England Patriots everything. So we had a couple kids who would pick the entire New England Patriots skill positions. And then I joke about hating the New England Patriots because it's way too much fun to pretend that with middle school students. They can't contain their anger. It's hilarious. So I ended up picking a few of the New England players on week 2, and the kids kind of freaked out, right? Because they're like, but you supposedly hate Rob Gronkowski. Why are you picking Rob Gronkowski? And I was explaining to them about, I don't really care about my personal feelings for the players. I'm looking at value for the position. And there's always a really powerful feeling, and it happened twice in the elective, where I was talking to the kids about something, and I was showing them the formulas for a PPR league, and they literally go, oh, it's order of operations, we just did that. Like, they saw it for a tiny moment, and they're like, and a couple of them were upset, because they're like, this is supposed to be fun. Why is all of the math here?
Why is there math?
Yeah, and it was just such an amazing opportunity.
Or it was probably something like because it was like receptions plus yardage or something like that. Yep. I imagine.
Yep, and then you can't just add straight across, and
right. Okay.
So it was a really, really cool moment, and it doesn't happen very often, but that sticks with kids, and those kids were absolutely more receptive later in the year. When I say this is real world learning, they had seen me prove it a few times already in ways that they didn't expect. It was so much more effective later.
Yeah, man, I mean, that's the thing. When I showed up at our draft with my laptop with an Excel spreadsheet with all these different equations, I had people looking at me like, what in the world are you doing? And then last year I came out with Yahoo rated the best draft in our class. I mean, an injury killed me for the season, but so be it. But
that sounds like an excuse, Will.
It is fun when you can actually go on and use some of these skills that you learned in your math classes and actually apply them to something that really interests you.
Yeah, and I think that there's something about, like, you're not going to be able to show a kid exactly what you're covering every day. But if you can show them a logarithmic function in an algorithm that matters to them, like, you don't need to do it every day. Like, that sticks with a kid. And so if you have the opportunity even to do it once with something really valuable, especially in high-level high school mathematics where it gets harder to find those real-world applications, those really matter and are super valuable.
Right. Well, I guess it seems like we pretty much covered everything we wanted to talk about. So I don't know about you. I feel like this went well for the first time.
Yeah, I feel it was a lot of fun, and we'll see how the sound quality ends up on the back end. But the goal of just forcing us to have a high level conversation about like teaching pedagogy, I feel like we hit that goal.
There we go. So. Yeah, that being said, that will conclude this first episode, and we will talk again in a couple of weeks.
All right. See you then, Will.
Yep. See ya.